I'm going to read you the first chapter of the Psychopath Club. Darrell Martock's 16th birthday fell on the 11th day of June 2003, which was why he was going to kill somebody on the 10th of June. He'd been planning the deed for plenty of time, of course. Even before his 15th birthday, the idea had been in his head, bouncing around like a pinball ricocheting between bumpers. All Darrell had to do was hit the flipper button just right to send the ball shooting up the pinball table into the target, and kapow! Jackpot! The machine would blare, and everything around him would explode into flashing lights and a cacophony of sound. But Darrell wanted the flashing lights and the noise to remain safely in his head, not to take on reality. Police sirens and strobes did not figure in his plan. Well, they did, of course, but it was vital for him to be well out of the way before they came on the scene. Darrell didn't want his ass hauled off to jail before his victim's blood had even had the chance to congeal. Because Darrell didn't intend to stop at one victim. Darrell wanted his trail of death to be more than one corpse long. And if he was to achieve that goal, Darrell had to make sure he got away with his killings, every single one of them, for as long as he could. He wanted his game of murder pinball to clock up plenty of extra balls and replays. Darrell, in other words, had to be smart, smarter than the average psychopath. His plan had been growing inside him pretty much since his parents had separated. Before even waiting for the divorce, they had moved almost as far apart as they could without crossing an international border. His father had gone south to Georgia, while his mother had gone north, with the reluctant Darrell in tow and fetched up here in Muldoon. Darrell hadn't lived a week in Muldoon before he realised that he despised the pissant little town from the bottom of his heart. And with a heart as black and villainous as Darrell knew his own was, there was room for a lot of hate in it. The discovery hit him as he woke up one morning with cold feet. He curled them back under his bedclothes in an attempt to find some warmth for his toes, and as he did so, he realised that he had done the same damn thing every morning he had woken up in Muldoon. It didn't help that he was 5 feet 11 inches tall and his comforter was only 5 feet 6 long, because his mother hadn't quite realised that her son was a young man rather than just a kid. But the main reason was geography. Muldoon was a stupid little town in a stupid little state where it snowed every time you farted and froze solid for 6 months of every year. So no matter what he put on his feet or how many layers of it, his feet were always cold. Always. His feet were never not cold. Once he'd taken note of this, every day began the same hateful way. Darrell would awaken to the ache of cold feet, each toe a tiny misshapen ice cube. As the days passed, the state of his feet began to turn into an obsession. Even wearing socks to bed didn't solve Darrell's problem. The feeling of them, confining and awkward on his feet before he went to sleep, annoyed him. And he always ended up kicking the socks off overnight. And in the morning, that meant cold toes for Darrell Martock again. 10 cold toes. Why 10? He didn't know the answer. 10 was an arbitrary number, and that was how many toes you had. And fingers, of course. Except for Rodney Leach's big brother, who managed to cut one off while he was chopping logs for the furnace. See, that was the kind of state he had to live in. A state where you had to keep furnaces going all the year round, burning up wood and oil and gasoline and causing pollution and deforestation, and you needed to cut your fingers off into the bargain to make their fires keep burning. Or you could freeze to death as the other alternative. Your toes going colder and colder and colder until you couldn't feel them anymore, and then they became gangrenous. Dead, in other words. They turned black, like the polar expeditionaries of 100 years ago. Darrell had read a book about some of them. They froze all their toes off trying to get to the South Pole, and some other guy reached it ahead of them. So being British, these guys just said pip pip to each other and smacked each other on the shoulder heartily and trudged off into the snow with their toes turning black until they couldn't walk anymore, and then they died, with their ridiculous moustaches turning white from the snow, and their feet black as hell from the ankles right down to the end of their toenails. Darryl always pictured it as a greedy black, with a bit of blood here and there, only not very much blood on account of how their feet were so frozen that the blood could scarcely get into them anymore. Of course, they could have been Americans. Now, Americans wouldn't have just shrugged and let the ice grow on their moustaches. No, they'd have looked meaningfully at each other and gritted their jaws. Perhaps one of them would have rolled his chewing tobacco from one cheek to the other and spat on the ground just to show where the South Pole was. And then they'd have gone after that varmint Amundsen and his Scandinavian creeps and shot the bastards full of hot lead. Yeah. And then they'd have died from the ice with black feet, but in a manly frontiersman, all-American way. No crawling into a tent saying, "Pip, pip," or "Tell the people back home we did it for the Queen." They'd crawl on until they couldn't crawl anymore, and then die with their bodies pointing back towards America and civilization. Civilization. If this was civilization, why were his feet cold? Why did he have to have feet anyway? Why couldn't he have wheels or hooves? Feet just look stupid, like deformed hands. So Darryl was glad to welcome his murder fantasy into his mind, simply as a means of distracting him from his cold feet in the morning. He had daydreamed of killing his enemies for quite some time, but now he was forced to live in Muldoon and wake up with cold feet every day. He found the fantasy changing from a vague occasional reverie into a regular daily event. Soon it began to develop further, to mutate into a swampy morass below the surface of his mind, always there, always at the edge of his consciousness, ready for him to slide into whenever he was bored or some jerk at school annoyed him. There were a lot of jerks at Darryl's school, and a lot of boredom in his life because Muldoon had so little to occupy an active mind. And upon his 15th birthday, when he hadn't bothered to hold any kind of celebration because he didn't see any point in marking the fact that he kept on breathing for another 12 months, he had spent half the day fantasizing about blood and mayhem. Finally, he had confronted himself, somewhere within the grim passageways of his own mind, the narrow corridors whose walls seeped sweat and greenish bile, and struck a deal with himself. By the time he was 16, Darryl Martock would either be out of Muldoon or he would kill someone. And now Darryl was 15 years, 364 days old, and he was still in Muldoon. So that was that. No point in running away. Where would he go? To his father in the south? Not a chance. He had been planning his murder for weeks, honing and refining the scheme. The choice of victim was a tough one. There were so many people in his life whom he despised. His parents were both prime candidates, but after a while, he rejected them both. His father was in Georgia, well beyond Darryl's reach, and had made it plain that visiting his son and ex-wife in Muldoon was not high on his list of priorities. This suited Darryl fine in one way because he hated his father, but at the same time, Darryl resented his father's abandonment of him. It wasn't logical, and he knew it wasn't logical. But since when did logic interfere with emotion? His mother now. He despised his mother too. He despised her for marrying his father and for having given birth to him, and for giving him a candy-ass name and then spelling it an unusual way, so that every time he had to give his name, he was forced to spell it out. D-A-R-R-O-L-L. It was the O that threw people. They would look up at him in confusion, their mouths ironically in the shape of an O itself, and he'd have to repeat himself every damn time. He despised his mother for not being good enough in bed to keep his father around, and for being weak enough to let his dad mess around with other women and then leave her for one of them, and he despised her for bringing him to Muldoon most of all. Yes, his mother was the obvious target, living in the same house and seeing him every day, but that was the problem, he realised. If his mom turned up murdered, who the hell else would the cops look for when it came for a suspect? His mother hadn't formed any new relationships since his father had quit the marriage. She didn't go out to work or leave the house at all most of the time. He spent the day in the easy chair in front of the television, drinking coffee in the mornings and switching to alcohol at some point after lunch. It wasn't much of a life. Darryl had more than half convinced himself that it would be no less than humane to put an end to her routine. But how could he do so without going straight into the fame from the crime? Reluctantly, Darryl had started to consider a wider range of potential victims. There were plenty of reasons for one person to off another. Racial hatred was a biggie. But Darrell didn't know any people who weren't white in Muldoon. That was the sort of town Muldoon was, white as the snow that blanketed it from fall to spring. Likewise, gang violence was always listed as one of the biggest causes for the deaths of guys aged under 25. But Muldoon didn't have any gangs, unless you counted some of the cliques at school. School. There was no shortage of people he despised at Strauss High. Hardly a member of staff in the whole place, from Principal Tidmarsh downwards, but he wouldn't have loved to shove a gun into the mouth of and pull the trigger and spatter their worthless academic brains all over the nearest wall. But he did not possess a gun or the means of acquiring one, and he somehow couldn't see himself overpowering a grown adult male with his lanky, unmuscular frame. There was Mrs. Patterson, who was in her 50s, but she was made of rawhide and concrete blocks. And if he swung a punch at her, all he would get was sore knuckles. No, not Mrs. Patterson. Nor Miss Krukowski, who was younger and less of a dried-up old harridan than Mrs. Patterson. Miss Krukowski attended judo classes, and it would not only be disastrous, but embarrassing if he went for her with a knife or something, only for her to pick him up and dump him on his ass. By this process of elimination, Darrell had narrowed his field of potential victims down to one group, the idiots from Muldoon and other nearby towns with whom he had to share classes at Strauss High. And from that field, he had come down to one, Ed Crow. Tomorrow, Darrell Martock would be 16 years old, and so today, Ed Crow was going to die.